He had 37 seconds before she died. 3 armed men, 1 narrow corridor, a woman with no way out. The storm had already knocked out every camera on floors 40 through 52, and nobody in the security booth was watching anyway, because the security chief was on the payroll of the man who'd sent those 3 men up here in the first place. Dylan Mercer stood at the far end of the hallway, a maintenance bag hanging from his left hand, a flashlight in his right. He was wearing gray work pants and a shirt that had a small coffee stain near the collar. He looked like nobody. He was supposed to look like nobody. That had always been the point. Before you find out what happened in that corridor, and what Dylan did in those 22 seconds that changed everything. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a comment below and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Give this video a thumbs up if you're already hooked, because this one goes deep. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The storm arrived without much warning, the way the worst things usually do. By 6:15 in the evening, the wind off Lake Michigan had turned mean. Not just cold, but aggressive. The kind that found gaps in your coat you didn't know existed. The Weather Service had called for heavy rain and possible thunderstorm activity. What hit downtown Chicago instead was something closer to a small siege, sustained gusts of 53 miles per hour, lightning that illuminated the skyline in long white pulses. Rain so heavy it looked solid from a distance, like the city was being wrapped in gray gauze. 41 floors up, inside the Vantara Tower, most of the office workers had already gone home early. The building's property manager had sent a floor-wide advisory at 4:50, suggesting non-essential personnel leave before 6. By 5:30, the elevator banks were thick with people dragging laptop bags and umbrellas toward the parking garage. Dylan Mercer watched them go. He was eating a sandwich at the small maintenance break room on the 38th floor. Turkey on wheat, a bag of pretzels, a thermos of black coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. He wasn't supposed to clock in until 7, but he'd come in early. He always came in early on storm nights. Something about the way tall buildings behaved when the wind was serious. Small anomalies in pressure readings, elevator doors that started hesitating, ventilation systems that hummed at slightly different frequencies. It made him uneasy if he wasn't there to watch. Old habits. He was 37 years old, and he looked it in a way that was hard to put into exact words. Not old, not young. Just used. Like a good tool that had been put to work and put back in the drawer too many times. There were lines around his eyes that didn't come from laughing. His hands were rough in a way that maintenance work alone didn't account for. He moved through spaces quietly, almost carefully, as if he was always half-conscious of the exits. Most people in the building didn't know his last name. To the daytime staff, he was the night guy. To the woman at the security desk on the lobby level, he was the quiet one. His supervisor, a heavy-set man named Carl, who ran the facilities team and spent most of his actual work hours on a fantasy football app, thought Dylan was a little strange but reliable, and had stopped asking personal questions after Dylan had given monosyllabic answers to 3 of them in a row. That was fine with Dylan. Strange and reliable was a good combination for what he needed to be right now. He folded the wax paper from his sandwich into a small square, tucked it into his bag, and pulled out his phone. One unread text. It was from his neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski, 68 years old, semi-retired schoolteacher, the closest thing he had to a village when it came to raising a child alone. Rosie's asleep. Don't worry. Storm sounds bad out there. You okay? He typed back quickly. All good. Thank you. Tell her I'll be there before she wakes up. He stared at that last sentence for a second after he sent it. It was the promise he made every night. And every night, it was the one thing that kept everything else in order. His decisions, his risk assessments, his margins. As long as that was the goal, home before Rosie opened her eyes, everything else could be managed. He pocketed the phone and stood up. What? Natalie Prescott had not planned to be in the building after 6. She hadn't planned a lot of things that had happened in the past 11 days, and she was starting to deeply distrust her own capacity to anticipate anything anymore. She was 30 years old, which people in her industry still seemed to find startling. 30-year-old CEOs weren't unusual, but 30-year-old female CEOs running a logistics company that moved cargo across 4 continents apparently remained a novelty worth commenting on. She had stopped being annoyed by it somewhere around her 28th birthday and started using it instead. People who underestimated her based on her age and gender tended to be less careful around her. Being underestimated had its uses. Right now, though, none of that strategic thinking was helping her. She was sitting at her desk on the 44th floor, the one with the glass wall facing north, and the city beyond that glass was invisible. Just black water and strobing lightning and the occasional silhouette of another tower in the distance. Her desk was covered in printed spreadsheets, annotated in 3 different ink colors. Her laptop had 4 windows open simultaneously. On the small credenza behind her desk sat a mug of tea she'd made 3 hours ago and never touched. 11 days. 11 days until the merger closed. $800 million. The deal that would take Prescott Global Logistics from a strong regional player to a genuine international force. The deal her father had spent the last 4 years of his life trying to build before his heart gave out, leaving it unfinished and leaving her holding the pen. She had believed, until 11 days ago, that the hardest part was behind her. Then she had found the anomaly. It was almost nothing, a rounding error in a quarterly reconciliation that her finance director, a cautious man named Paul Eaton, who'd been with the company for 9 years, had flagged in a footnote of an internal audit. He hadn't called it anything alarming, might want a second look at the intercompany transfer logs from Q3. Some figures are slightly inconsistent with prior periods. Natalie had given it a second look. Then a third. Then she'd spent 6 days working backward through the transfer records with 2 outside forensic accountants she'd brought in quietly, telling no one on the executive team. What she'd found was not a rounding error. It was a systematic hemorrhage. $4.3 million, moved in fragments small enough to avoid automated flagging, across a period of 8 months, through 3 shell entities she'd never seen before and couldn't trace through normal channels. Someone had been stealing from her company for the better part of a year. Carefully. Patiently. Someone who understood the architecture of her financial systems well enough to know exactly where the blind spots were. That kind of knowledge didn't come from outside. She told no one. Not her CFO, not her legal team, not her head of corporate security, a silver-haired former federal agent named Warren Holt, whom she'd hired 18 months ago on a strong recommendation and had trusted completely up until about 9 days ago, when one of the forensic accountants had quietly shown her a transaction that had Warren Holt's digital fingerprints on it in a way she couldn't explain away. So now she was alone on the 44th floor of a building that was emptying out in the middle of a storm, with a USB drive in her jacket pocket containing every piece of evidence she'd compiled, and a list of questions she couldn't ask anyone who worked for her. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She picked up. The voice on the other end was male, measured, with the kind of flatness that sounded practiced. "Miss Prescott, you should leave the building immediately." "Who is this?" "Someone who knows what's on that drive. Leave now. Take the south stairwell to the parking level. Don't use your badge. They're watching the reader logs." The line went dead. She sat very still for approximately 4 seconds. Then she stood up, put on her coat, picked up her bag, and walked toward the south stairwell. She never made it. The maintenance corridor on the 43rd floor connected 2 of the building's mechanical service zones, a narrow, low-ceilinged passage that ran behind the elevator shafts, lit by fluorescent strips that flickered slightly in bad weather due to an electrical conduit that Dylan had filed a repair request on twice and been told was a low-priority item. It was not a place anyone went unless they worked in the building's guts, which was exactly why Dylan had used it, almost every night for the past 14 months, to move through the tower without being seen. He was in the corridor checking a pressure valve on the secondary HVAC loop when he heard the stairwell door at the south end bang open. He went still. Not the stillness of surprise, something more deliberate, more complete. He pressed himself against the conduit panel to his left and simply stopped being something a moving eye would catch. She came through fast. Dark coat, bag on one shoulder, short heels that were not made for running, but she was trying anyway. Her face was controlled. Not panicked, but working on it. He could see the effort it was taking her to keep her breathing even. Natalie Prescott. He knew her face. He'd been watching this company for 14 months from angles no one knew to look. She stopped at the T-junction in the middle of the corridor, looking both directions, clearly trying to remember a layout she'd never had reason to learn. Her breath was fogging slightly in the cold air near the mechanical systems. She made a choice and turned right. Dylan stayed where he was. 30 seconds later, 3 men came through the same stairwell door, not running, walking with purpose, spread out across the width of the corridor in a pattern that was professional, not rent-a-cop professional, not nightclub bouncer professional. Something else. The way they moved, the spacing between them, the way the middle one's right hand stayed loose and slightly forward. Dylan cataloged it automatically, the way you always do once someone teaches your nervous system to never stop reading a room. Mercenaries, or very close to it, Victor's people. He had been waiting for Victor Ashcroft to make a move like this for 3 months. He had not expected it to happen while Natalie Prescott was still in the building. That was a variable he'd gotten wrong. He felt the specific irritation of a miscalculation, sharp, brief, and then gone, because you didn't have time for feelings when geometry was about to become a problem. He moved. Not fast. Fast was loud. He moved the way water moves, choosing the path of least resistance, filling the space that was available, taking the shape of the situation. He came around the junction corner at a controlled walk, maintenance bag in his left hand, flashlight in his right, and stepped into the corridor 30 feet ahead of the 3 men and about 20 feet behind Natalie, who had stopped moving when she saw what was waiting for her at the far end of the passage. 2 more men. She'd walked straight into a pinch. She turned, saw Dylan. Her eyes did the math fast. Maintenance worker, no apparent help, and came to the wrong conclusion, which was understandable. The 3 men behind Dylan had stopped walking. The 2 ahead of Natalie held their position. Everyone was making decisions. Dylan set the maintenance bag down on the floor beside him. He straightened up. He looked at the 3 men between him and the stairwell. "Wrong hallway," he said. His voice was flat and completely calm, the way a man sounds when he isn't performing anything. The man in the middle, the one with the forward-carried right hand, looked at Dylan for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much trouble this was going to be. Then he made a small motion with his head to the man on his left, and they both started moving. What happened next took 22 seconds. Natalie counted later because her mind had grabbed onto the number the way shocked minds sometimes grab onto concrete details. 22 seconds. She knew this because she was pressing herself against the wall, and her eyes were on her watch, and she was telling herself to breathe. And then it was over. She couldn't describe it precisely even afterward, and she tried. She told a federal investigator weeks later that it wasn't like a movie fight. It was too fast and too quiet for that. Dylan Mercer didn't shout. He didn't make any theatrical movements. He used the corridor itself, its width, the conduit housing on the left wall, the junction corner, the specific distance between himself and each man, like a set of tools he'd already inventoried before anyone threw a punch. There was something almost mathematical about it, except that mathematics didn't usually end with 3 large men on a concrete floor. The 2 men at the far end, the ones blocking Natalie, came forward when the noise started. Dylan was already past the junction by then. He didn't fight them so much as redirect them, using the momentum of the first one against the wall and the second man's own forward charge as the mechanism for putting him down. 22 seconds. Natalie was looking at 5 unconscious men on the floor of a maintenance corridor, and the maintenance worker was standing in the middle of them, barely breathing hard, and he had a small cut above his left eyebrow that was beginning to bleed in a thin line down toward his cheekbone, and he was pressing the back of his wrist against it with an expression that suggested he was mildly annoyed by it. He looked up at her. "You okay?" he asked, the same flat, even voice. She stared at him. She stopped. Tried again. "Who are you?" He picked up the maintenance bag from where he'd set it. "Dylan, night maintenance." He paused. "Your south stairwell is compromised, so is the lobby. Whoever called you, they were trying to move you, not help you." "How do you know someone called me?" "Because you came through that door looking like someone told you to." He glanced at the men on the floor. "These guys have been on the 43rd and 44th floors for about 20 minutes. I've been watching them since they came off the service elevator." She looked at him with an expression that was recalibrating fast. She was sharp. He'd known that from a distance, but watching it happen up close was different. Most people, in the aftermath of what she'd just seen, were still trying to get their legs back under them. She was already asking operational questions. "My phone." "Don't use it," he said. "Assume they can hear anything that goes through the cell network in this building. They've had time to set up." "Who is they?" He considered for a moment. There was a right way to do this and a wrong way, and the wrong way was to give her a full briefing in a corridor with 5 men who were going to start waking up in the next 3 to 6 minutes. "Come with me," he said. "I'll explain what I can while we move." "Come with you where?" He turned toward a section of wall to his left. A panel she hadn't noticed, painted the same gray as everything else, with a small, recessed handle. He opened it. Beyond it was darkness and the sound of the building breathing, air moving through ducts, the low mechanical hum of systems that never slept. "There are tunnels inside this building that aren't on the public schematics," he said. "I know every one of them." He looked at her. "You have something on you, a drive, a document, something that someone is willing to send 5 people to take. Am I wrong?" Her hand moved involuntarily toward her coat pocket, stopped. "That's what I thought," he said. "You want to stand here or you want to move?" She looked at the unconscious men. She looked at the open panel. She looked at Dylan Mercer, with his coffee-stained shirt and the thin line of blood on his face, and the maintenance bag over his shoulder, and she made a decision the way she made all her decisions, fast, grounded, and without much room for sentiment. "Move," she said. He nodded once. "Step carefully. The floor inside drops about 3 inches. She followed him in. The panel swung shut behind them, and the gray corridor with its fallen men was gone, replaced by the dark interior of a building that turned out to be much more complicated than it looked from the outside. So, she was already realizing, was the man who knew his way through it. The tunnel smelled like old concrete and machine oil, and Natalie had to duck her head in 2 places where the conduit housing dropped low across the ceiling. Dylan moved ahead of her without a flashlight. He'd clicked his off after the first 30 seconds. And she followed the sound of his footsteps and the faint luminescence of what turned out to be glow-in-the-dark tape applied at knee height along the left wall, faded enough that you'd only see it once your eyes adjusted. "Watch the step down," he said, voice low, not whispering. Whispers carried differently through ductwork. He'd learned that a long time ago in spaces a lot more dangerous than this one. She stepped down. Her heel caught slightly, and she put a hand against the wall to steady herself. The wall was cold and slightly damp from the storm pressure outside, the building flexing minutely against the wind. "How long have these tunnels been here?" she asked. The original building schematics are from 1987. The maintenance infrastructure was designed by a different firm than the architectural team, and they never fully reconciled the documents. There's about 1,800 square feet of service space in this building that doesn't appear on any of the floor plans on file with the city. He paused at a junction, looked both ways out of pure habit, then turned left. "I found them my 3rd week on the job." "And you just kept them to yourself?" "They were useful." She followed him around the corner and into a slightly wider section of passage where the ceiling lifted enough that she could stand straight. The hum of the building was louder here. They were close to one of the mechanical rooms, she guessed, because the air was warmer and smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid. "You said you'd explain," she said. "I will." He stopped at a door, heavy, industrial, with a manual latch, and pulled it open. "In here first." The room on the other side was not what she expected. She had been picturing another gray service box, pipes and valves and nothing else. What she stepped into instead was a space roughly the size of a large walk-in closet, and someone had been using it deliberately for a long time. There was a folding table along the left wall with 2 monitors on it, both dark, connected by a cable bundle that disappeared into the ceiling. There was a small battery backup unit on the floor beside the table. There were printed documents, some of them annotated in handwriting, arranged in overlapping stacks with hand-labeled sticky tabs. There was a corkboard on the wall with photographs pinned to it, faces, building diagrams, what looked like financial flowcharts hand-drawn on graph paper, and lengths of red string connecting them in a way that made her stomach do something uncomfortable. There was also a photograph of a little girl taped to the wall above the corkboard with a single piece of masking tape, slightly crooked. She was maybe 5 or 6, dark-haired, grinning with a gap where a front tooth had recently been. It was printed on plain paper, slightly pixelated, like it had been blown up from a phone photo. It was the only personal thing in the room. Dylan set down the maintenance bag and sat in the single chair in front of the monitors. He pressed a button on the battery unit, and the screens came alive. Not internet, she realized, but a local feed. Security camera footage. The building's own camera network, or some portion of it, routed here through a tap she couldn't see. "Sit down if you want," he said. "There's nowhere comfortable. Sorry." She looked around, found a 5-gallon utility bucket turned upside down near the wall, and sat on it. She had sat in worse places. She'd spent 3 days in a logistics warehouse in Guadalajara once when a customs situation turned ugly, sleeping on stacked pallets. She didn't think this was the moment to mention that. "Start from the beginning," she said. "How long have you been in this building?" 14 months, 2 weeks. "You took the maintenance job specifically to—" "Yes." She looked at him. The cut above his eyebrow had slowed its bleeding and was drying to a dark line. He hadn't touched it again. He was watching the monitors with a habitual attention, eyes moving between screens without rushing. "Why?" she said. "Why would you—" "You don't work for me. You're not law enforcement. Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me." He said it the way someone says a thing they've said before in their own head, to themselves, working out whether it's still true. "I found something, about 16 months ago, that I couldn't leave alone." "Found what?" He reached across to the documents on the table and pulled a folder from beneath 2 others without disturbing the stack, the movement of someone who knew exactly where everything was. He held it out to her. She opened it. Inside were printed financial documents, transfer records. She recognized the format. It was the same architecture as the records her forensic accountants had been pulling apart for the past week. But these were older, and there were more of them. And the picture they painted was significantly worse than what she'd found on her own. "You found this inside the company systems," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I found the first thread before I ever set foot in this building. I was doing contract electrical work. I had a smaller company before, did commercial electrical retrofits. One of our jobs was a renovation on the 14th floor here, about 16 months ago. I was running conduit in a server room and I had access I wasn't supposed to have. Not through hacking, just through a door that should have been locked and wasn't. I saw something on an open terminal, just a line item that didn't make sense. I wrote it down. And then? And then I pulled on the thread." He looked at her. "I'm good at pulling threads." That was not a boast. It was simply a statement of capability, delivered with the same flatness as everything else he said. She was starting to understand that Dylan Mercer did not perform his competence. He just had it, the way some people just have it, and he'd never developed the habit of advertising it because advertising it had never been the point. "The thread," she said. "Where did it lead?" He reached over to the keyboard, and one of the monitors shifted from camera feeds to a static document, a flowchart, the same kind she could see sketched on the corkboard, but cleaner, clearly something he'd built over time and refined. She leaned forward. At the top of the chart was a name she knew. Victor Ashcroft, 61 years old, private equity. Ashcroft Capital Management, headquartered in New York with offices in 4 other cities. On paper, a sophisticated financial operator who'd built a reputation for acquiring undervalued mid-market companies and restructuring them for growth. He'd been a peripheral figure in the merger discussions, one of several institutional investors who stood to profit if Prescott Global Logistics completed the deal and its valuation climbed accordingly. She had met him twice, once at a conference in Denver, once at a dinner her CFO had organized. She remembered finding him polished and attentive in the way of someone who'd spent decades learning how to make people feel heard. She had not found him alarming. "Ashcroft," she said. "He doesn't want the merger to close," Dylan said. "Not because it's bad for his investment, because it's good for yours. If Prescott Global gets significantly larger, new infrastructure, international contracts, fresh capital, then the acquisition play he's been building toward for the past 14 months stops working." "What acquisition play?" Dylan pointed to the lower section of the flowchart. "He's been positioning to buy the company at distressed asset pricing. To do that, he needs the merger to fall apart, the company's valuation to crater, and the board to panic. If all 3 happen simultaneously, he can step in with a lowball offer, and the board takes it because they think it's the best available option." She stared at the chart. "The stolen funds. That's part of it, yeah. The $4 million wasn't just theft. It was designed to surface at a specific moment, right before the merger close, in a way that would create a regulatory review. 11 days of regulatory uncertainty with an $800 million deal on the table would spook the other party badly enough to trigger the material adverse change clause. They'd walk, she said. Hartwell Group would walk. That's the goal. She was quiet for a moment. The storm outside was doing something to the building. She could feel it now, a subtle movement in the floor, the structure swaying in a range so small it was barely perceptible, the way tall buildings were engineered to do. She'd never noticed it before. She noticed it now. "The security chief," she said. "Warren Holt." Dylan nodded once. "On Ashcroft's payroll for approximately 11 months. I have his banking records, a routed account in his wife's maiden name, receiving irregular deposits from a shell company called Meridian Advisory Group, which doesn't exist as a real entity. Meridian traces back to a holding company in the Cayman Islands that Ashcroft controls through a nominee director." She looked at him. "How did you get his banking records?" A pause. Not guilty, exactly. More like the pause of someone who knew the question had a complicated answer and was deciding how much of the complication was worth getting into right now. "I know people," he said. "People who know how to find things without leaving traces. I won't put you in a position of having to defend how this information was obtained." He met her eyes. "Everything in those files is real. The chain of evidence has gaps, which is why I haven't handed it directly to law enforcement. I need documents that were obtained legally and that will hold up in court, which is why I've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" "For you to find it yourself." He said it simply. "You're smart and you're thorough and you have legal access to the systems. I knew once you started looking, you'd find the anomalies. I just needed you to find them before Ashcroft realized you were looking." She sat back on the upturned bucket and looked at him for a long moment. Outside, lightning came through somewhere. She felt the building's electrical system flicker, just for half a second, the lights dimming and recovering. One of the monitors briefly went dark. "You've been in this building for over a year," she said, "watching, gathering information, and you never—" She stopped. "You could have told someone. You could have sent an anonymous tip. Anonymous tips get buried, or they reach the wrong person. In this building, right now, I count at least 4 people on the executive and security teams who are in Ashcroft's pocket." He paused. "Warren Holt isn't alone. Your head of IT operations, a man named Gary Stiles, has been providing access credentials that Ashcroft's people use to set up the transfer routing. 2 members of your board, Reynolds and Chin, have been receiving what are documented as consulting fees from a company that traces back to Ashcroft. They'll vote however he tells them to when the time comes." She heard herself exhale, a long, slow breath she hadn't quite planned. Reynolds she might have believed, but Chin had been her father's friend, had stood at the funeral and said things about legacy and trust that she had held on to in her lower moments. "Chin," she said quietly. Dylan said nothing. He wasn't going to soften it, and he wasn't going to pile on it. He just let her have the moment, which she appreciated more than a reassurance would have felt. "The drive," he said finally. "What's on it?" She reached into her coat pocket and held it up. 14 months of transfer records, 2 of the shell company traces, and the complete digital trail of the Q3 fund movement. My accountants pulled it through legitimate system access. He looked at it the way a mechanic looks at a part he's been missing. "That's the gap I needed. Between what you have and what I have, it's enough," he said. "Combined, it's enough. But it doesn't matter unless we get it out of this building tonight." She looked at the monitors. On 3 of the screens, she could see men moving through corridors. Not maintenance workers, not security staff. Wrong posture, wrong formation. 7 that she could count, spread across multiple floors. "How many does he have in the building?" "I've counted 9 since 7 o'clock. 3 more are probably staged in vehicles outside, but the storm is making that harder to confirm." He pulled up a building layout on the second monitor. A schematic she'd never seen before, more detailed than anything in the official files. "All 4 elevator banks are being watched. The south stairwell is where your 3 came from. The north stairwell has 2 more at the lobby level. The loading dock exits are covered." "So we're trapped." "For now." He said it without alarm. He said it the way a man says it's raining, a condition to be worked with, not a verdict. "The communications network, cell service in this building runs through a local repeater on the 41st floor. I think they've interfered with it. There's a hardwired emergency communications terminal in the building management office on the 22nd floor that bypasses the cell infrastructure. If we can reach it, can we?" "Not directly, not the way the building is currently occupied." He turned back to the monitors. "But there are other options." She looked at the corkboard again, the photographs, the string, the hand-drawn diagrams. 14 months of work, 14 months of early mornings and night shifts and eating cold food in a hidden room behind the walls of a building where no one knew his name. She looked at the photograph of the little girl above it all, slightly crooked on the wall. "Your daughter," she said. He glanced up at the photograph. Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a small movement around the eyes, there and gone. "Rosie," he said. "She's with someone tonight?" "My neighbor. She's fine." He said it quickly, the way you say a thing you need to be true so badly you've decided to stop examining it. "She's asleep." "How old?" "6 in February." Natalie looked at the photograph again and then back at Dylan, and she thought about a man who had spent 14 months, nights presumably, always nights, in this building, in this room, eating sandwiches alone in the dark while his 6-year-old daughter slept without him. Not for money. Not because anyone told him to, because he had pulled a thread and found something ugly and couldn't put it down. "Who were you?" she asked. "Before maintenance work." A pause, longer than the others. "Navy," he said. She waited. "SEAL teams, 8 years." He reached over and adjusted one of the monitor cables, which didn't need adjusting. "My last deployment went bad. Lost people I was responsible for. Came home." He shrugged, a small, controlled movement. "That was 6 years ago. I've been doing other things since. Like this." Rosie came first, everything else came after. She wanted to ask more, and she could see from the way he'd turned back to the monitors that the door on that subject had been opened about as far as it was going to go tonight. She let it close. "All right," she said. "What are we doing?" He looked at her with something that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a reluctant appreciation. She'd gone from processing shock to asking operational questions in under 2 minutes, twice now. "There's a maintenance shaft that runs from the 38th floor to the 23rd, he said. "It was used for equipment transport during the original construction and was sealed off in 1991, but the seals are mechanical, not structural. I opened them 8 months ago to inspect the shaft for my own routing purposes. It's narrow, 18 inches at the tight point, but passable." "For you, maybe. You're—" She stopped. "Bigger than you," he agreed. "I know, I've done it. It's uncomfortable, but it's possible. You're smaller. It'll be easier." She looked at the monitor showing the corridor outside, empty for now, but she could see a light source moving at the far end, the sweep of a flashlight. "And if they find the panel to this room while we're in the shaft?" "They won't." He said it with a certainty that was not cockiness. It was the certainty of someone who had already accounted for that variable. "I've had this room set up for 14 months. The entry panel is indistinguishable from the surrounding wall when it's closed. It registers on the building schematics as a structural column. 6 different people have walked past it since 8 o'clock tonight, and none of them have found it." She stood up from the bucket. Her knees protested. She'd been in a more crouched position than she'd realized. She straightened up and put the USB drive back in her coat pocket, buttoning it this time. "There's something you should understand," Dylan said. He was still looking at the monitors. "The men Ashcroft has in this building, they're not amateurs. The 3 you saw in the corridor were reasonably well trained. What's on the upper floors is better than that. I've been watching them move for the past 2 hours, and 2 of them, at minimum, have a background that goes beyond private security work." She absorbed this. "You're saying this could get more complicated." "I'm saying we handle it smart, not fast. Smart gets us both out. Fast gets one of us hurt." He finally looked at her. "Can you do exactly what I tell you, when I tell you, without asking me to explain it first?" It was a reasonable question, and she knew it. She was also, in the deep center of herself, a person who profoundly disliked being told what to do without an explanation. She had been running her own company since she was 27 years old, and before that she had argued with professors, mentors, and her own father about the precise reasoning behind every decision she was expected to follow. But she also knew, with the clear-eyed practicality that had kept her functioning through the last 11 days, that she was sitting in a hidden room inside a compromised building with 9 armed professionals somewhere above and below her, and the man across the table had just put 5 of those professionals on a concrete floor in 22 seconds and hadn't been breathing hard afterward. "Yes," she said. He nodded once. "Good." He stood, picked up the maintenance bag, and slung it over his shoulder. He opened a side panel she hadn't noticed, a section of the room's own wall that swung outward on a hinge, and reached inside to pull out a second, smaller pack, dark canvas, which he set on the table and opened quickly. Inside, 2 radios, small and compact, the kind that used encrypted short-range frequency, a small medical kit, zip ties, a folded paper document, the building schematic, she guessed, a phone, older model, that was clearly not connected to any network, and something wrapped in a cloth that he glanced at and then closed the bag over without further comment. He handed her one of the radios. Channel 3. Push to talk. Only use it if we're separated and you need to navigate. How likely is it that we get separated? Hopefully not at all. He checked his watch. The shaft entrance is 12 minutes from here if we move carefully. There's a stretch of about 40 feet on the 39th floor where we'll need to cross open corridor. That's the risk point. We do it fast, and we do it in the window between patrol sweeps. He looked at her. I've been timing them for the past 90 minutes. We have about a 4-minute gap. We'll use 3 of it. And the 4th minute? Margin for error, he said. There's always error. She put the radio in her coat pocket. You've been thinking about this all night. I've been thinking about this for 3 months, he said. I just didn't know you'd be in the building. He moved to the door, stopped, looked back at her. One more thing, he said. The people running these patrols, they are looking for you specifically, not me. To them, I'm still a maintenance technician who got unlucky in a corridor. I want to keep it that way as long as possible. Which means if we encounter someone, you let me lead the conversation. Don't show recognition. Don't show fear. If I'm talking to someone and I use the word pressure, as in a pipe has a pressure issue, something like that, I need you to move to your left immediately without looking at me. Can you do that? Move left on pressure. Yes. Understood. He opened the door. The smell of the tunnel came in, cold concrete and machine oil and the building's deep interior breath. Outside the narrow passage, the storm was still working on the city, and somewhere above them 9 men with bad intentions were moving through corridors they thought they owned. She followed him out. The door swung shut behind them, plunging the hidden room back into the dark, the photograph of Rosie invisible, now on the wall above the corkboard, the gap-toothed grin waiting in the silence for a father who had promised to come home before morning. Dylan moved through the dark without hesitation, the glow tape at knee height marking the path in pale green intervals. Natalie kept 2 steps behind him, her breathing controlled, her mind moving fast across the architecture of everything he'd told her. Victor Ashcroft, Warren Holt, Gary Stiles, Reynolds and Chin. 14 months of careful construction, a conspiracy so patient and so well hidden that it had nearly worked. Would have worked, she thought, if a maintenance technician with a coffee-stained shirt and a 6-year-old daughter at home hadn't pulled a thread one evening in a server room and decided he couldn't put it down. They reached the junction at the T intersection where she'd first come through, and Dylan turned without pausing, leading her deeper into the building's hidden interior, further from the places anyone thought to look. Somewhere above them, a door opened and closed. Footsteps, muffled by concrete and distance, moved across a floor neither of them could see. Dylan slowed by a fraction. She felt it more than saw it. And then, when the footsteps faded, he moved forward again at the same steady pace. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The maintenance shaft on the 38th floor was exactly as narrow as Dylan had described, and Natalie discovered that knowing a thing intellectually and experiencing it physically were 2 entirely different propositions. 18 inches at the tightest point meant her shoulders cleared the sides by perhaps 2 inches on each side, and the shaft ran at a slight diagonal that forced her to move in a half-crouch for the first 20 feet. Dylan had gone first, pulling the canvas pack behind him, and she could hear him moving ahead in the dark. Not struggling, but not graceful either, the sound of someone making their body do something it wasn't designed for through sheer practiced familiarity with the discomfort. She was 3 minutes into the shaft when her coat caught on a protruding bolt head, and she had to stop, reach back with one hand in almost total darkness, and work the fabric free without being able to see what she was doing. The darkness in the shaft was not the darkness of a room with the lights off. It was absolute in a way that pressed against the eyes. She kept her breathing even by counting 4 counts in, 4 counts out, a technique she'd developed during the worst months after her father died, when anxiety had a habit of arriving at 3 in the morning. "You okay back there?" Dylan's voice, low from somewhere ahead. "Fine," she said. "Coat, fixed." 12 more feet, and it opens up. She moved forward. The bolt had left a small tear in the wool that she noticed with a distant, almost academic irritation. The coat had cost $400, and she'd had it for 3 years. And then she decided that was probably the least relevant thing currently happening in her life and let it go. The shaft did open up. Not into a room, but into a wider service corridor, taller, lit by a single emergency fluorescent that had been running on battery backup long enough that its color had gone slightly yellow. Dylan was already there, standing with the canvas pack at his feet, looking at his watch. 43 seconds ahead of what I planned, he said, and she couldn't tell if that was satisfaction or just information. Do you always time things to the second? I time things to the second when seconds matter. He picked up the pack. There's a surveillance blind spot on the 22nd floor that I've used before. The camera covering the northeast corridor was damaged in a maintenance incident 8 months ago. The building management filed a repair request that's still pending. It means we have about 40 feet of unmonitored corridor to cross before we reach the building management office. Is that the only way to the communications terminal? There's a secondary access point through the electrical room on 21, but it requires a key I don't have. This way's cleaner. He glanced at her. The corridor on 22 has had 2 patrol sweeps in the last 90 minutes. 12-minute intervals, give or take a minute. We're at the 8-minute mark since the last sweep, meaning we have roughly 4 minutes. Roughly. I want to be through and inside the office in under 2. They took the stairwell down, the northwest one, which Dylan had confirmed was clear by some method she hadn't entirely followed involving the placement of a small piece of tape at ankle height that, if disturbed, would indicate foot traffic since he'd set it. The tape was undisturbed. She was starting to understand that the building, for Dylan, was not a place he moved through. It was a system he'd mapped and instrumented over 14 months, a machine he understood from the inside in a way its architects probably didn't anymore. The 22nd floor looked like every other floor in the building's middle section. Wide corridors, carpeted, corporate neutral, the kind of design that aimed for professional and landed on forgettable. The lights were on emergency power, so dimmer than normal, casting the kind of flat illumination that made everything look slightly unreal. Dylan held up a hand at the stairwell door. She stopped behind him. He cracked the door a half inch and looked through for 15 seconds, longer than seemed strictly necessary, and then eased it closed again. Clear, he said quietly. We move now. Don't run. Running sounds wrong on this flooring. Fast walk. They came through the door together and crossed the corridor in what felt to Natalie like an exposed eternity and probably took no more than 8 seconds. Dylan had the building management office key on his ring. He had a lot of keys on his ring, she'd noticed, more than any standard maintenance assignment would typically require, and the door was open and closed behind them before she'd had time to fully register the room. It was a utilitarian space, metal shelves, binders, an ancient rolling chair, a desk that had seen better years. And on the wall, mounted in a gray steel housing with a handset and a small digital panel, the hardwired communications terminal. It was the kind of infrastructure that buildings from this era had been required to include for emergency use, and that had been quietly superseded by cellular technology and largely forgotten, which was probably why Ashcroft's people hadn't thought to disable it. Dylan uncradled the handset and checked the panel. A green light, active. He held it out to her. It's yours. She took it. Her hand was steadier than she expected. She'd been running on adrenaline and focus since the moment she'd come through that stairwell door on the 43rd floor, and she'd noticed that fear for her tended to function less like paralysis and more like a frequency shift. Everything getting sharper and more specific, the noise falling away. Her father had been the same. He used to say that pressure was just a word people used when they hadn't decided yet what they wanted to do. She dialed. Her attorney first, Marcus Webb, 60 years old, 22 years of corporate law, the one person outside the company she trusted completely. He answered on the 3rd ring, which told her he'd been awake. Natalie. Marcus. I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I'm done. A brief pause. Okay. She talked for 90 seconds. Concise, specific, hitting only the essential facts. The conspiracy, Ashcroft, Holt, and Stiles, the 2 board members, the location of the evidence, her current situation in the building. She heard Marcus begin to say something twice and stop himself twice. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The federal contacts, he said. You want Devers or Okafor? Okafor. He's faster, and he doesn't need everything explained twice. Give me 20 minutes. I may not have 20 minutes on this line. 15, he said. Give me 15. Don't go anywhere you can't hold. She hung up. Dylan was at her, listening. He hadn't looked at her during the call, which she noticed, giving her the privacy of it, or just not wasting attention on something he couldn't contribute to. Probably both. Now we wait? She asked. Now we secure, he said. Waiting in one place is what gets you found. We need to move to a position that's defensible and that lets me see what they're doing. He unzipped the canvas pack and took out the folded schematic. There's a room on the 24th floor that was a secondary security monitoring station in the original building design. It was decommissioned in the early 2000s when the building upgraded to centralized surveillance. The hardware's been pulled out, but the room is still there, and it has a hardwired connection to several camera feeds that I've kept live by rerouting the signal path. You rerouted the signal path, she said. Over about 3 weekends last year, yes. Does your supervisor know you were doing any of this? Carl barely knows what floor he's on most days. There was no contempt in it, just a statement of observable reality. Come on. They took the stairwell up 2 floors, and Dylan ran the tape check again. A new piece from his pocket, pressed across the stair riser at ankle height before they moved onto the floor. The 24th floor corridor was darker than 22. No emergency lights in this section, or they'd burned out. Dylan used the flashlight, keeping the beam low, and pointed at the floor. The decommissioned security room was at the end of a short branch corridor, behind a door marked electrical, no entry, which was exactly the kind of door that ensured nobody looked behind it. Inside, the room was empty except for what Dylan had put there. A small folding table, 2 monitors connected to a battery source, and the now familiar bundle of rerouted cables disappearing into the ceiling. He powered up the monitors. The feeds came on. She counted 8 cameras. Not all of them in the building, she realized. Some of the feeds were from positions she couldn't identify. Some of those are external, she said. 4 of them, he pointed. Loading dock, West Street entrance, the parking structure ramp. And that one? He pointed to a screen showing the lobby from an angle that wasn't quite the lobby's own camera perspective. Is from a camera I mounted in the lobby's ventilation housing about 10 months ago. The building's standard lobby cameras have a blind spot along the south wall. Mine doesn't. She looked at the lobby feed. 3 men visible. Not security staff, wrong clothing, wrong posture. One of them was on a phone, although given what Dylan had said about the cell network, she had to assume they had their own equipment operating independently of the building's infrastructure. Can you hear what they're saying? No microphone, just video. He pulled up the schematic again. I've been tracking 9 in the building, 3 in the lobby, 2 we can account for from earlier. He meant the corridor on 43, the 5 who were no longer a problem, which leaves 4 unaccounted for on the upper floors. Ashcroft himself? 48th floor. He came in at 6:40 through the executive entrance using a badge that Warren Holt would have provided. He's been up there since. He paused. The executive boardroom has a direct access point to the parking structure via the private elevator. That's his exit route when he decides this is done. She looked at the camera feeds for a moment, thinking. The storm on the external cameras was still heavy. The West Street entrance showed rain moving nearly horizontally, and the parking structure ramp was running with water. He thinks he's running this from the 48th floor, she said. He's up there waiting for confirmation that I've been, what? The fire doors on 48 are the original 1987 installation, commercial-grade steel, fire-rated. They engage with a magnetic lock that can only be released manually from the outside or from the main ground-level panel. From inside the room, there's no override without a key. And the key is on my ring. He held it up briefly. The ring had somewhere between 15 and 20 keys on it, and she had no way of knowing which was which, but it didn't matter. She took a breath. You need to get to 47, which means you need to get past whatever's between here and 47 without triggering their check-in alarm first. Yes. And once you trigger the lockdown, Ashcroft will immediately know the situation has changed. He'll be calling out to his people. He'll be calling, but his cell signal in that boardroom is unreliable on a good day. That room sits at the junction of 2 structural steel columns that create a significant signal shadow. On a night when the repeater on 41 is already compromised, he'll be lucky to get a text out. He folded the schematic carefully, but his people in the lobby will figure out something's wrong. That's the part with the tightest margin. How tight? 8 minutes? Maybe 10. between when I activate the lockdown and when his people in the lobby start moving in force. He looked at her steadily. By then, Marcus Webb's federal contact needs to have people on their way here. An active federal response to a building with confirmed armed operatives will make Ashcroft's lobby team do one of two things. They hold or they run. Either way, they stop being our problem. And if the federal response takes longer than 10 minutes? He didn't flinch from the question. Then we deal with what's in front of us. But I've been in situations with tighter margins. She believed him. She believed him the way you believe someone who says a thing quietly without any surrounding performance. The way you believe a statement that clearly comes from lived experience rather than bravado. Whatever had happened in the Navy, whatever had gone wrong on whatever deployment had sent him home carrying damage she could only partially see, it had also left him with a very precise understanding of what he could and couldn't do under pressure. She thought about asking more. She decided there was no time. "What do you need from me?" she said. "I need you to stay in this room with the camera feeds and use the radio if anything on those monitors changes significantly. New people appearing, existing people moving toward the stairwells in number." Channel 3. He checked the battery pack. "You have about 4 hours of power on these monitors. We won't need 4 hours." "How do I know what significantly means?" "If 2 or more people on those screens start moving in the same direction at the same time, that's significant. If any of them pull out weapons that weren't visible before, that's significant." He paused. "Use your judgment. You've been running a company since you were 27. You know when something is wrong." It was the most direct acknowledgement he'd made of who she actually was, and it landed differently than she might have expected. Not like flattery, just like an accurate observation, the same way he stated everything else. "There's one more thing," he said. He reached into the canvas pack and removed the cloth-wrapped object she'd noticed earlier and set it on the table without unwrapping it. "If someone comes through that door who isn't me, that's your option." She looked at it. "Is that?" "It's a last option, not a first one. The door has a manual slide bolt. Use it as soon as I leave." He looked at her. "I mean it about the bolt. Don't open it for anyone until you hear my voice." "What if they take your radio?" He almost, not quite, but almost, smiled at that. It was the first time she'd seen his face do anything approaching it. "Then you'll hear someone using my voice very badly," he said. "You'll be able to tell." He picked up the pack, left the cloth-wrapped object on the table, and moved to the door. He stopped. "The 4-minute margin I told you about," he said. "For error." "Yes. I always plan 4 minutes for error, and I almost always use all of it." He said it with the specific dryness of someone who had learned that honesty about limitations was more useful than confidence that outran reality. Keep that in mind. Then he opened the door, looked both ways, and was gone. She slid the bolt. The monitors showed her 8 different pieces of the world. The lobby with its 3 men, the parking ramp, the exterior views running with stormwater, 2 interior corridor shots she recognized as being on floors she hadn't visited tonight. She pulled the chair to the table and sat down and set the radio in front of her and watched. 40 seconds after Dylan left, she saw one of the 3 lobby men show his phone to another one. A reaction. The second man's body language shifted, becoming more attentive. Something had come through on their communication system. The check-in clock, she realized? They'd missed a check-in. The men from the 43rd corridor. She picked up the radio. "Dylan." A pause. Then quiet. "I see it. Keep watching." She kept watching. The 3rd lobby man moved to the elevator bank. The second one went to the building's front entrance and looked out at the storm for a moment before turning back. They were recalibrating, trying to figure out what had happened to 3 men who weren't reporting in. 8 floors above her, somewhere in the service passages and hidden shafts of the Vantara Tower, Dylan Mercer was moving upward through a building that had just gotten more dangerous. He took the northwest stairwell to 28, then cut across to the service corridor that ran parallel to the executive floor elevator bank. He'd mapped this route in reverse 6 weeks ago, walking it as part of a scheduled elevator inspection, clocking times and noting where the camera angles created shadows long enough to move through without appearing on any monitored feed. The problem was the 34th floor. Between 28 and 37, the building's original layout had a section of corridor near the mechanical room that had no camera shadow. The coverage was complete, overlapping from two angles, and there was no point in the normal work schedule when maintenance staff would be in that corridor in the middle of a night like this without a specific work order on the system. Dylan had known about this problem for 3 months. He'd solved it 4 weeks ago. The building's secondary HVAC unit on the 34th floor had a control panel in that corridor. He had filed a maintenance request in the system, standard protocol, routine pressure calibration, dated for this week, open and unresolved. If anyone checked the work order system, they'd find a legitimate maintenance ticket covering this exact corridor at this exact time. Whether anyone would think to check was a different question, but it was the only cover available, and it was better than nothing. He moved through the corridor without rushing. The camera saw a maintenance technician with a bag over his shoulder, walking with purpose toward a HVAC panel at the end of the hall, which was exactly what the work order said would be happening. He stopped at the panel, opened it, spent 45 seconds performing a check that was real. He always made the cover work actually work, because half measures had a way of creating problems. Then closed it and moved on. The 37th floor was clear. The 38th, which he'd come from, was his own territory, and he moved through it quickly. 39 had 2 of Ashcroft's people in the main corridor, not the service side, the executive side, outside the office suites. He watched them through a ventilation grill for 90 seconds. They were positioned facing the main elevator bank, which told him they were managing the external perimeter, not conducting active search. They didn't know yet that the situation on 43 had changed. He went around them through a route that added 4 minutes to his timeline and emerged on 41 through a mechanical room door that connected to the service corridor. 41 was where Ashcroft's people had placed their cell jamming equipment. He'd suspected this and confirmed it now by the slight interference pattern on his own encrypted radio when he passed a storage room near the building's telecommunications hub. He didn't try to disable it. Disabling it would require time he didn't have, and more importantly, disabling it would immediately signal to every one of Ashcroft's people that something had changed. The jammer staying on was actually useful for another 8 minutes. 42, 43. He went past the corridor where the 5 men were still down, not stopping. He could hear faintly movement from the stairwell on the south end. Someone coming up, moving with purpose. He pressed into the service passage before the stairwell door opened and waited as 2 sets of footsteps came through, moved past, went further up. They were consolidating, looking for their missing team. He had maybe 6 minutes now. 44 was Natalie's floor. The executive suites, the corner office with the north-facing glass wall where he'd watched her work through more late nights than she probably realized anyone had noticed. He went through it at a controlled jog, no longer concerned about sound above concern about time. 45, 46. The stairwell here was narrower. It was the secondary stairwell, not the main one, which was why nobody was guarding it. He took the stairs 2 at a time, pack bouncing against his back. 47. The fire suppression control panel was in the mechanical room adjacent to the stairwell landing, a room he'd been in 4 times over the past year, always with a valid work order, always when no one senior was likely to cross-reference his access log. He had the key to the mechanical room door. He had the access code for the suppression panel because he'd watched the building's fire systems engineer enter it during a routine inspection 13 months ago and had a good enough memory for numbers to hold on to it. He punched in the code. The panel woke up. Green status across the board. Every system in the building nominal. Because whatever else Ashcroft's people had done tonight, they hadn't touched the fire suppression infrastructure. That was the kind of interference that triggered automatic alerts to the fire department, and apparently even they had that much caution. He navigated the panel's menu. He'd studied the system documentation during a weekend shift 9 months ago, when the building manager left a binder of infrastructure manuals in the unlocked supply room on 36. He knew the system the way he knew the shaft routes and the camera positions, thoroughly, specifically, with the particular attention of someone who had learned to treat information like ammunition. Zone selection, floor 48, boardroom section. Suppression type, dry system activation, localized discharge. Fire door protocol, concurrent seal on activation. He looked at the screen for 1 second. Thought about Rosie, asleep in Mrs. Kowalski's apartment, her gap-toothed smile printed on plain paper and taped to the wall of a hidden room. He pressed the activation. Somewhere 2 floors above him, he heard the suppression system engage. A mechanical sound. Brief. followed by the distinct low clunk of fire door magnets energizing and steel meeting frame in the boardroom section of the 48th floor. Victor Ashcroft, and whoever was with him, had just run out of room. The radio clicked. Natalie's voice, controlled and tight. The lobby. They're all three moving to the elevators, and I just picked up two more from the 39th floor heading down the main stairwell. I know, Dylan said. He was already moving toward the stairwell, already calculating. How long ago did Marcus say 15 minutes? A pause while she thought. 11 minutes ago. Then we have 4 minutes until federal response. Possibly 5. He hit the stairwell door and started down. Lock that door and do not open it. Above him on 48, behind fire doors that weighed 400 pounds and were sealed with a magnetic lock rated at 2,000 pounds of pull force, Victor Ashcroft was on a phone that couldn't quite get a signal through, standing in a boardroom with floor-to-ceiling windows showing nothing but storm and dark. And the quiet realization was arriving, the way it arrives for men who have spent their lives outmaneuvering others, that somewhere in the infrastructure of the building he'd thought he controlled, someone had been thinking 10 moves ahead of him all along. He just didn't know yet who that someone was. He would find out. They all found out eventually. Dylan came down through the building in the dark, legs working, the canvas pack on his back, the maintenance bag left somewhere on 47 because he was done needing the cover it provided. The situation had moved past cover. It was in the open now, all of it. The conspiracy and the evidence and the men in the lobby and the sealed boardroom and the USB drive in a woman's coat pocket 2 floors below him. 4 minutes, possibly 5. He'd worked with less. The bolt slid back on Natalie's count of 3. She'd been counting Dylan's footsteps in the stairwell, recognizing the pattern of them, the specific weight and rhythm she'd already memorized without meaning to. And he came through the door and pulled it shut behind him, and she slid the bolt again before she'd consciously decided to. He was breathing harder than she'd seen him breathe all night, not winded, but working. There was a new scrape along his right forearm that hadn't been there before, visible where his sleeve had been pushed up, and he was favoring his left side slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that she noticed. "You're hurt," she said. "Stairwell railing caught me on 39. It's nothing structural." He set the canvas pack down and looked at the monitors immediately, the way he always looked at information sources before he looked at anything else. "How many in the lobby now?" "All 5. The 2 from 39 came down about 90 seconds ago." She pointed to the screen. "That one. The one on the phone. He's been on it for 3 minutes." His own equipment, satellite-assisted probably. Dylan watched the screen. The man on the phone had his back to the lobby's main entrance, which the storm was rendering nearly opaque behind the glass. He's trying to reach the boardroom. Can he? Eventually, the signal shadow up there is bad but not absolute. If he's patient enough and the equipment is good enough. Dylan checked his watch. 13 minutes since you called Marcus. The federal response window is closing. As if the building itself had been listening, Natalie's radio, the hardwired communications terminal line that Marcus had told her to keep open, crackled. She grabbed the handset. "Webb." Marcus Webb's voice came through with the slight compression of a relayed call. "Okafor's team is 4 minutes out. 2 vehicles, 6 agents. They have the warrant package. I gave them everything you gave me. They know about Ashcroft. They know about Holt. And they know the building is occupied by armed personnel." A pause. "Natalie, they need someone to meet them at the building entrance and confirm the situation is contained enough to enter. Is it?" She looked at Dylan. He held up 4 fingers, then pointed at the lobby screen. She understood. 4 armed men still mobile in the lobby. Not contained. Not yet. "Give us 3 minutes," she said into the handset. "Meet at the west entrance in 3 minutes. Tell them to look for a woman in a dark coat." "Natalie, 3 minutes, Marcus." She set down the handset. Dylan was already unzipping the canvas pack. He removed the 2 remaining zip ties, the compact radio, his own, not the pair they'd been using, and looked at the building schematic one more time with the focused attention of a man confirming what he already knows, rather than learning something new. "The lobby has 4 of them," he said, not looking up. 3 are grouped near the elevator bank. 1 is near the front entrance. He folded the schematic. "The front entrance man is the problem. He's between you and the west entrance door. So we draw the 3 away from the elevator bank first." He looked up at her. Something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration of some kind, as if he kept making an assumption about her and she kept disproving it. The fire alarm panel in this building has a secondary annunciator on the 26th floor, he said slowly, thinking it through as he said it. If I trigger a localized alarm on 28, kitchen suppression system, it'll read as a contained incident. The protocol requires security personnel to respond to 28 to confirm. 3 of those lobby men are standing near the elevator bank because they're managing vertical access. A building alarm changes their priority. They go up to 28. 2 of them will. 1 will stay. Standard protocol. He paused. That leaves you with 1 man between you and the west entrance. One I can manage, she said, and the steadiness of her own voice surprised her slightly. What about the front entrance man? He's watching the street. His back is partially to the interior. You come through the lobby from the north corridor side, not the elevator bank side, and you're in his peripheral vision at best. Dylan looked at her. Move at a normal pace, not running. If he turns, you're maintenance staff. You work here. You're confused about the alarm. And if he's seen a photo of me, then you're out of the lobby before he finishes deciding what he's seen. He met her eyes. You have 40 feet from the north corridor entrance to the west door. At a fast walk, that's 12 seconds. She thought about it for exactly as long as it deserved, which was about 4 seconds. Okay. Once you're out, turn left along the building's exterior. The west entrance connects to the service alley. It's covered. The storm won't hit you directly. Okafor's people will come from Michigan Avenue, so they'll see you when they turn into the alley. He picked up the pack. Don't go back for anything. Whatever happens inside after you're out, you keep moving until you're with the federal agents. The drive stays with you. What happens inside after I'm out? I hold the position and make sure Ashcroft stays sealed until Okafor's team is in the building. He said it simply, like a logistical statement. She looked at him. Dylan. What? That's not... You can't just... She stopped, because she could see from his expression that he had already thought through every version of this and had arrived at this one for reasons she was probably not going to be able to argue him out of in the time available. You said 4 minutes for error. I said I usually use all of it. He picked up the canvas pack. I've still got some left. The alarm panel for the 26th floor was accessed through a maintenance hatch in the ceiling of the decommissioned security room. Dylan had shown her the hatch earlier without explaining what it led to, and now she understood that he'd been noting it as a possible tool, the way he noted every physical feature of every space he moved through, filing it for later without any certainty it would be needed. She watched him pull himself up through the hatch and disappear for 90 seconds, and then he dropped back down and said, 30 seconds. She moved to the door. Her heart was doing something emphatic against her ribs, and she was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound in another room. Present, noted, not acted on. The cut on your eyebrow has dried up, she said. She didn't know why she said it. It was a ridiculous thing to say. He touched it briefly. Yeah. He looked at her. You're going to be fine. I know that. I know you know. A beat. Move as soon as you hear the alarm. Don't wait for anything. The alarm went off. Not the full building klaxon, a localized signal, a repeating 2-tone pattern that meant a specific zone event rather than full evacuation. The effect in the building system would be exactly what Dylan had described, a maintenance incident on 28 requiring security response. She heard, even from the 24th floor, the distant sound of elevator doors, the lobby team sending people up. She opened the door. The corridor was empty. She moved at a fast walk, the way Dylan had said, and she kept her chin up because people who are trying not to be seen look down, and people who belong somewhere look straight ahead. The north stairwell to the lobby level was 30 feet from the security room door, and she covered it without incident, pushed through into the stairwell, went down 1 flight, and came through the lobby level door. The lobby was large. The Vantara Tower's ground floor had the cathedral ceiling ambition of 1980s commercial architecture. A lot of marble and vertical space and lighting that was currently running on emergency power, which dimmed it considerably and shifted the geometry of the shadows. She saw immediately that Dylan had been right about 2 men going up. The elevator bank area was empty of Ashcroft's people. The call had gone. They'd responded. 1 man remained near the security desk in the center of the lobby, and he was facing the desk, writing something or checking something, his back not fully to her but close enough. The entrance man was exactly where he'd been on the monitor, right side of the lobby, facing the glass, watching the storm in the street beyond. 40 feet. West entrance door, north corridor side. She walked. Her heels on the marble were louder than she wanted them to be. This floor was the only carpeted section, and carpeted wasn't quite the right word. It was more like a thin runner along the center path, and she was slightly to the left of it. The sound wasn't loud. In the context of an active building alarm on 28, it wasn't unusual, but it was present. The man at the security desk turned his head. Not all the way. Just enough to register movement in his peripheral vision. She felt his attention like a change in air pressure, and she kept walking. Same pace, same forward-facing posture, coat, bag. The purposeful movement of someone who works here and is confused about why an alarm is going off at this hour and wants to get to an exit. He turned back to the desk. 20 feet. The entrance man still had his back to her, his attention on the street, where the headlights of a vehicle had appeared on the far side of the glass. Moving slowly, the deliberate pace of law enforcement in low-visibility conditions. 10 feet. She pushed through the west entrance door. The cold hit her immediately. Not rain directly, because the service alley had an overhang, but the wind came in from the south end of the alley, and it was serious wind, the kind that found every gap. She turned left, as Dylan had said, and moved along the building's exterior in the shadow of the overhang, and she could see the headlights she'd seen through the lobby glass. 2 vehicles, pulling into the alley entrance from the north, moving without lights and sirens, because this was a covert approach, and Okafor's team knew better than to announce themselves to armed men in a lobby. The lead vehicle stopped. A door opened. A man came out, mid-40s, dark coat, the specific bearing of federal law enforcement that she recognized because her father had dealt with enough federal agencies over the years that she'd learned to read it. He looked at her and said, "Prescott? Okafor?" "Deputy Director Chen, Okafor's inside coordinating. Are you injured?" "No, there are 4 armed men in the lobby. 2 went up on elevator response to a manufactured alarm on 28. The other 2 are at the security desk and the west entrance. Victor Ashcroft is sealed in the executive boardroom on 48. Fire doors, magnetic lock." She pulled the USB drive from her coat pocket. "This is primary evidence. There's additional documentation in a hidden room on the 24th floor. I can draw you the route." Chen took the drive. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized, the same slight recalibration she'd been seeing on Dylan's face all night, except this one was more bureaucratic. He was revising his briefing upward. "The individual who called this in, Marcus Webb, your attorney, said there was someone else in the building assisting you." "Yes." "Name?" "Dylan Mercer. He's the one who has the sealed boardroom. He's still inside." She paused. "He's not law enforcement. He's maintenance staff. When your people encounter him, I need them to know he's ours." Chen nodded and turned to relay something to the second vehicle. She watched agents deploy with the specific efficiency of people who had planned an entry and were now executing it, and she felt the first loosening of something she'd been holding tight since the moment she'd walked into the 43rd floor corridor, which felt like 4 days ago and had been less than 3 hours. She thought about Dylan in the building. She thought about the margin he said he usually used all of. Then she followed Chen's team back through the west entrance because she wasn't done yet, and she wasn't going to stand in an alley when there was still work to do. Inside, the lobby confrontation lasted less than 90 seconds. Federal agents through 2 entrance points simultaneously, clear identification, the specific tone of authority that tells trained personnel when the math has changed and holding is no longer rational. The man at the security desk went down on his knees with his hands up before anyone had to say it twice. The entrance man took 4 seconds longer and then made the same decision. Neither of them was being paid enough to make a different choice. The 2 men who'd gone up to 28 were contained on that floor by the second vehicle's team, who'd split off on entry. Clean. Okafor's people were good. Dylan came down from the 24th floor through the main stairwell 4 minutes after the lobby was secured, which meant he'd been watching the whole thing on his monitors and had waited until the outcome was certain before he moved. She understood this without being told. It was exactly what she would have done. He came into the lobby still carrying the canvas pack, and he looked at the federal agents and the 2 men in zip ties on the marble floor, and at Natalie standing next to Deputy Director Chen, and he stopped. She could see him running a quick inventory, exits, personnel, threat assessment, all of it in the time it took most people to notice he'd entered the room. Then his shoulders dropped by approximately half an inch, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a significant physical response. "Mr. Mercer," Chen stepped forward. "Deputy Director Chen, Federal Investigations. We need to debrief you." "I know," Dylan said. He looked at Natalie. "You okay?" "Yes?" She paused. "Nice work on the boardroom." The panel wasn't complicated. He said it like it genuinely wasn't. Chen was already directing agents toward the elevator bank. The priority was the 48th floor, Ashcroft, still sealed, still presumably attempting to reach his people and getting nothing useful back. She looked at Dylan and said quietly, "Come on, I'm not letting them do that part without us." He looked like he was going to object. Then he looked at her face and didn't. The executive elevator required Natalie's badge, which was the first time all evening her badge had been useful for something, and she noted the irony. The ride to 48 was 41 floors of the specific silence of people who have been through something together and are now in a different phase of it, the aftermath phase, where the body starts trying to cash the checks. The adrenaline rote and finds the balance lower than expected. Dylan was standing with his back against the elevator wall, eyes forward, and she noticed his right hand had a shallow cut across two knuckles that hadn't been there at the start of the night. He hadn't mentioned it. He probably hadn't thought about it. "The stairwell railing on 39, she said. He looked at his hand. "Yeah. You should have someone look at that. It's fine." "I know it's fine. Someone should still look at it." He almost, again, almost, did the thing that wasn't quite a smile. "I'll add it to the list." The elevator opened on 48. The corridor outside the executive boardroom was the most expensive-looking space she'd seen all night. Deep carpet, wood paneling, the kind of restrained corporate elegance that cost a lot of money to look like it wasn't trying. The fire doors were exactly as Dylan had described. Commercial-grade steel, sealed flush in their frames. The magnetic lock engaged and holding. Chen's agents cleared the floor from both ends. 3 agents positioned at the fire doors. Natalie stood 8 feet back with Dylan beside her, and one of the agents looked at Dylan's ring of keys and said, "The override key?" Dylan stepped forward, found the key without needing to look, the specific one, on a ring of 20, without hesitation, and handed it over. The agent used it. The magnetic lock disengaged with a clunk that resonated in the corridor, and the fire doors swung outward. Victor Ashcroft was standing in the center of the executive boardroom when the doors opened. He was 61 years old, and he looked it tonight in a way that photographs of him probably didn't. The specific aging that happens to powerful men when power stops working for them, when the room they're in stops responding to the authority they've spent decades cultivating. He was in a dark suit, expensive, and his silver hair was still arranged correctly, and he held himself with the posture of a man who had survived many difficult meetings. There were 2 other men in this room with him. She recognized one as his personal attorney, whom she'd met at a conference, and both of them looked significantly less composed than Ashcroft. He looked at the agents. He looked at Natalie. Then he looked, briefly and with obvious confusion, at the man in the maintenance uniform standing behind her, and she could see him trying to reconcile that image with the events of the past 2 hours and not quite getting there. "Mr. Ashcroft," Chen said, "I'm going to need you to—" "I want my attorney present before—" "That's him on your right," Chen said pleasantly. "He can advise you as we talk. You're not being detained yet. We're going to walk downstairs and have a conversation." Ashcroft's eyes moved back to Natalie. They were the eyes of a man who had thought very carefully about this situation, had been thinking about it, presumably, since the fire doors sealed, running through his options and finding them insufficient one by one. "You have nothing actionable," he said. "Whatever you think you've—" "I have 14 months of documentation," Natalie said. "I have the transfer records, the shell company traces, Warren Holt's payment history through Meridian Advisory, and the board communication logs from Reynolds and Chin." She kept her voice level and matter-of-fact, the way she ran board meetings, the way she'd learned to not let the size of a situation leak into her voice, even when it was leaking into everything else. "I also have whatever my investigators have been compiling on your Cayman entities, which I expect has gotten more interesting in the past few weeks." Something shifted in his face. Small, controlled, but real. "And I'd also like you to know," she said, "that the person who spent 14 months making sure that evidence survived long enough to be useful is standing right next to me, And he wasn't on your radar for a single day of those 14 months. She paused. You planned for everything except the maintenance worker. Victor Ashcroft looked at Dylan Mercer one more time. This time he looked longer and more carefully, and she could see the professional assessment happening behind his eyes. The revised calculation, the understanding that he was looking at something he had genuinely failed to account for, which was probably not a feeling he had often. Dylan looked back at him with an expression of absolute neutrality. Not contempt, not satisfaction, just the specific blankness of someone who has already moved past this moment and is thinking about what comes after. Ashcroft looked away first. Chen's agents moved him toward the elevator, his attorney beside him, talking rapidly in a low voice. The other man in the room, she didn't know who he was, some operational associate, went cooperatively and without drama. The boardroom emptied. Natalie stood in the center of it for a moment, looking at the long mahogany table, the chairs arranged in their proper positions, the north-facing windows showing the storm still working on the city, lightning in the distance now instead of overhead, the worst of it having moved east while they'd been underground. The carpet was deep under her feet. The room smelled like the room she'd sat in dozens of times for board meetings, for presentations, for the difficult conversation she'd had with Reynolds 6 months ago about the merger timeline that she now understood had been reported directly to Ashcroft within hours. Her father had chosen that carpet, had argued, according to his assistant, for a darker shade than the board preferred, and won, and been unreasonably pleased about it. She hadn't been in this room since the funeral. She had not let herself feel the full weight of the past 11 days until right now, standing in the room where the people who had tried to take everything her father built had been sitting 90 seconds ago, and she felt it come up through her chest in a way that she managed, barely, to keep in her face rather than let out of it. Dylan was standing near the door. He was looking at the window, giving her the same quiet privacy he'd given her in the hidden room when she'd heard about Chin. After a moment, she said, "My father picked that carpet." He looked at the carpet. "It's a good carpet." "He fought the board over the color for 2 weeks." She almost laughed. "He won. He always made a big deal about winning the small things because he said the big things took care of themselves, if you got the foundation right." Dylan didn't say anything, but he didn't move toward the door either, which she appreciated. "I inherited a company that someone was already hollowing out from the inside," she said. "I didn't know it. I'd been running it for 3 years and I didn't know." "You found it," Dylan said. "Almost too late." Almost isn't the same as too late. He said it the way he said everything. Not to comfort, just to be accurate. 11 days was enough. It's done. She took a breath. Not quite done. There's still the merger. There's still the board seats. Reynolds and Chin have to be removed. There's the forensic audit, the regulatory filings, the press statement that I need to have ready before this breaks publicly, because it will break publicly within 24 hours. And if I don't control the narrative, that's tomorrow, he said. She stopped. Tonight is done, he said. Tomorrow, you can put the pieces back. She looked at him. Howe was right, and she knew he was right. And she also knew that the habit of running forward, of already standing in the next crisis while the current one was still resolving, was so deep in her she sometimes couldn't tell when it was helping and when it was just a way of not letting herself feel the ground under her feet. She let herself feel it now. The carpet. The deep pile of it. The color her father had insisted on. The building not moving because the storm had eased, the lights still dim but steady. Your daughter, she said. What time does she wake up? He checked his watch. It was 1:10 in the morning. He'd come in for his 7 o'clock shift. He'd been in this building for 6 hours. Usually around 6:30, he said. 7 if I'm lucky. You'll be home long before that. Yeah. He looked at the window. Yeah, I will. She watched his face do the thing it did when Rosie came into the conversation. That small, present, private shift that wasn't for anyone else. The rest of his expressions were contained by habit and training and 6 years of learning to keep himself from taking up too much emotional space. But that one he hadn't managed to discipline all the way down, and she suspected he didn't particularly want to. She thought about a little girl asleep in a neighbor's apartment, not knowing that her father had just spent 6 hours keeping a building from falling apart, because that was what he did instead of sleeping, because some things you found and couldn't put down, and because some people were built in such a way that looking away from a wrong thing simply wasn't available to them as an option. "I need to go give a statement," she said. "Chen's going to want an hour at least." "I know, I've got one coming too." They walked out of the boardroom together. The corridor outside was busy now. Agents, building security personnel who'd been called in, a pair of forensic investigators who must have come with Okafor's team. Someone had restored the building's full lighting on the upper floors, and the executive corridor was bright for the first time all evening. A young agent approached Dylan with a notepad and a request to start the debrief right there in the corridor. Dylan looked at Natalie once, a brief, unelaborate look, the kind that said several things simultaneously without saying any of them out loud, and then turned to the agent and said, "Yeah, all right." And she watched him fold himself back into the business-like patience that was his default mode when there was nothing left that required something else from him. She turned toward where Chen and his team had set up a temporary command position at the end of the corridor. Somewhere below them, Victor Ashcroft was in an elevator going down, the empire of 14 months beginning to come apart thread by thread. Warren Holt was somewhere in the city, not yet knowing his phone was about to ring with news that would end his career and his freedom. Gary Stiles, Reynolds, Chin. The architecture of the conspiracy was still standing in its complete form for a few more hours before the weight of everything documented and evidenced and legally obtained would begin bringing it down piece by piece. She had the drive. She had the documentation. She had the testimony of the one person who had seen all of it from the inside, who had spent 14 months in a building that most people moved through without ever knowing what was running beneath the surface of it. Prescott Global Logistics was still standing. The merger was still alive. 11 days. She had 11 days, and she'd already done the hardest part. She walked toward Chen, coat still buttoned, the tear in the wool from the bolt in the shaft invisible from the front. Her heels were steady on the carpet her father had chosen. Outside the windows, the storm was moving east, and the city was beginning to come back into its normal shape. The lights of the other towers, the pulse of the streets below, the long, flat darkness of the lake beyond. She didn't look back at Dylan. She didn't need to. She could hear his voice, measured and specific, already giving the agent exactly what he needed to know, and nothing more than that. That was enough. For right now, that was enough. He was home by 3:17 in the morning. Mrs. Kowalski had left the hallway light on, which she always did when she knew he'd be coming in late, and he let himself in quietly and stood for a moment in the entry of his apartment with his shoes still on and the canvas pack still over one shoulder, not doing anything in particular, just standing. The apartment was warm and dark except for the light coming in from the street through the curtains, and it smelled like the lavender soap Rosie had decided was her favorite 3 months ago, and that he now bought in bulk because running out of it created a specific kind of 6-year-old crisis he'd learned to prevent. He set the pack down, took off his shoes, went to Rosie's room. She was asleep on her side, one arm around a stuffed rabbit that was missing an eye and had been missing it since she was 4 and had never seemed bothered by it. Her dark hair was spread out across the pillow in the chaotic way of children who sleep with their whole bodies, limbs at angles that looked uncomfortable and apparently weren't. Her breathing was the slow, deep breathing of someone completely unconcerned with the state of the world. He stood in the doorway for a while, not doing anything, just looking. There was a version of tonight that had gone differently. He'd run the variations during the debrief with Chen's team, not on purpose, just the way his mind worked, calculating backward from alternate outcomes the way it had been trained to do. A version where the timing on the 39th floor corridor was 3 minutes earlier. A version where the fire suppression panel had a different code than the one he'd memorized. A version where the 4-minute margin got used up, and then some. He didn't let himself stay in those versions. He'd learned, over 6 years of being a single father, that the mind has to be managed the same way a building has to be managed. You check the systems, you note the anomalies, and then you close the panel and go home. You don't stand in the mechanical room catastrophizing about the pipes. He reached in and pulled Rosie's blanket up where it had slid off her shoulder. She made a small sound and adjusted without waking. He went to the kitchen, made himself a glass of water, drank it standing over the sink. The cut on his knuckles had dried. The scrape from the stairwell railing was stiffening in the way that soft tissue damage does, making itself known now that the adrenaline had fully cleared his system. His left side ached where he'd taken the railing impact. He'd felt worse. He'd felt significantly worse, in places a lot colder and farther from home than this. I went to bed at 3:40 and was asleep in under 4 minutes, which was a skill he'd developed in the Navy and never lost. The ability to go under when the opportunity presented itself, regardless of what had just happened, because exhaustion was its own kind of enemy, and you didn't let it accumulate if you could help it. He woke at 6:50 to the sound of Rosie standing next to his bed, saying his name in the tone she used when she'd been standing there for a while, and was beginning to feel the situation warranted escalation. "Dad, Dad, you're home." "I'm home," he said. She climbed up onto the bed and sat on him, which was her standard greeting protocol, regardless of what she'd been told about letting him sleep. She smelled like lavender soap and sleep, and the particular warmth of a child who has been under blankets for 9 hours. "Mrs. Kowalski said there was a big storm," she said. "Were you in the big storm?" "A little bit." "Did you get wet?" "A little bit." She looked at his hand where the cuts on his knuckles were visible. She was 6, not 2. She noticed things, and she had the specific unfiltered quality of children who haven't yet learned that noticing things out loud is sometimes impolite. "You have an owie," she said. "I do." "How?" "Work stuff. It's fine." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Then she picked up his hand and held it in both of hers in the way she'd started doing in the past year, which he hadn't taught her and couldn't account for. This instinct toward the specific wound, this small, deliberate act of attention. He didn't know where she'd gotten it. Maybe she'd gotten it from nowhere. Maybe it was just Rosie. "Better?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Better." She put his hand down and flopped sideways onto the pillow next to him and said, "Can we have pancakes?" "We can have pancakes." "With the blueberries?" "Sure." "And the syrup that's not the fake kind." "The real maple syrup, yes." She seemed satisfied with the terms. She stayed there for another 10 minutes while he lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and let the morning be ordinary, which was the thing he'd been working toward since approximately 9 o'clock the previous evening. The ordinary morning. Pancakes with real maple syrup and a 6-year-old with an incomplete set of front teeth who held his injured hand in both of hers because she'd decided that helped. This was the thing he'd never told anyone, the thing he couldn't quite have explained in the debrief or in any other official context. The reason he hadn't walked away from what he'd found in that server room 16 months ago wasn't some elevated principle about justice or corporate ethics. It was simpler and more embarrassing than that. He had looked at a thread and known that pulling it would eventually lead somewhere that mattered, and he was constitutionally unable to leave something that mattered unaddressed. It was a flaw as much as anything else. It had cost him sleep and normalcy and the kind of easy peace that other fathers of 6-year-olds seemed to carry around without much effort. He had spent 14 months in a building instead of home, and he would carry that as a debt to Rosie that she would never know about and that he would never stop trying to repay in pancakes and maple syrup and presents. He got up and made breakfast. Rosie sat on the counter and talked at him while he cooked, which was their arrangement. He cooked and she provided commentary, and he responded to approximately 40% of it. And she didn't seem to notice or mind about the other 60. He had 3 missed calls on his phone from an unknown number. He didn't check them until after Rosie was settled at the table. He went to the hallway and called back. Natalie Prescott answered on the second ring. He wasn't surprised. He was perhaps slightly unprepared for the specific quality of her voice at, he checked, 7:14 in the morning, which was the quality of someone who had not slept and was running entirely on forward momentum and the kind of focus that certain people generate under prolonged pressure, the way other people generate panic. He'd seen it in the building the night before. He was hearing it now. "I've been up all night," she said, without preamble, which he appreciated. "The forensic audit team has been in the building since 4. Marcus has had 3 calls with the merger partner. Hartwell Group's general counsel is on board. They're not walking. The deal is intact. The regulatory filing is going in this morning with a full disclosure package that should preempt any review issues." A pause. The first gap in the momentum. Warren Holt was arrested at his home at 5:40. Gary Stiles turned himself in voluntarily through his attorney at 6. Reynolds is cooperating. He was apparently the most scared of the 3, and his lawyer got in front of it fast. Chin has not responded to his attorney's calls, which his attorney says is not good for Chin. "Ashcroft?" Dylan asked. "Federal holding. His attorney is filing motions this morning, but the evidence package is extensive enough that Chen isn't worried about bail." Another pause. "They found the Cayman accounts. and 4 additional shell entities beyond the ones you had documented. It's bigger than either of us knew. It usually is, he said. Through the kitchen doorway, he could see Rosie eating her pancakes, carefully putting exactly the right amount of syrup on each bite with the concentration of a small person for whom this ratio mattered enormously. I'm going to be in front of cameras in about 2 hours, Natalie said. Press conference, the statement is written. I know what I'm going to say. She stopped. Then, I want to say your name. He was quiet for a moment. I'd rather you didn't. I know, I expected that. She didn't push it. She'd known him for less than 12 hours, and she'd already learned when the door was closed. Can I ask why? He looked at Rosie. She'd finished the blueberries and was now using her fork to arrange the remaining pancake pieces into a pattern that seemed to have its own internal logic. Because I don't need a story about me, he said. And Rosie doesn't need people knowing what her father does when she's asleep. Natalie was quiet for a moment on the other end. He heard something in that quiet. Not agreement exactly, but understanding, which was a different thing and more useful. Okay, she said. I'll keep you out of it publicly. The federal record will have your name. I can't help that, and you'd expect it. But the press conference is about the conspiracy and the evidence and the company, not about you. That works? Another pause. Longer this time. There's something else, she said. I've been thinking about it since about 4 this morning, which is either a sign that it's a good idea or a sign that I've been awake too long and my judgment is compromised. I genuinely can't tell which. He waited. I'm creating a new security division, she said. Internal. Not contracted out, not managed through an HR structure that can be infiltrated the way Holt infiltrated mine. A small team that reports directly to me, with a mandate that goes beyond physical security, operational integrity, internal threat assessment, the kind of work that requires someone to actually understand how an organization's systems can be used against it. She paused. I want you to build it. Director of Strategic Security. You'd set the structure, choose the team, define the methodology. Reporting line is directly to me, no intermediaries. Dylan leaned against the hallway wall. Through the kitchen doorway, Rosie had given up on the pancake pattern and was now carrying her plate to the sink with the careful two-handed solemnity of a child performing a grown-up task. I have a maintenance job, he said. I know. I'm a maintenance technician, on paper. On paper, she said, you spent 14 months running a sophisticated one-man counterintelligence operation inside a 48-floor commercial tower. You prevented a corporate takeover that would have destroyed 400 jobs, and you did it while working night shifts and raising a 6-year-old alone. A beat. Your paper doesn't reflect what you are. He didn't say anything, not because he disagreed, but because the accuracy of it landed in a way that required a second. The salary is competitive, she said. More than competitive. And before you tell me about Rosie, there's a school 2 blocks from headquarters that has a wait list. Most people wait 18 months for. I can make a call. Flexible hours are not negotiable. They're written into whatever arrangement we make. If she's sick, you go. If there's a school thing, you go. This job works around your daughter, not the other way around. She paused. I've been a CEO since I was 27 years old. I've made mistakes I'm not proud of about work-life prioritization, and I'm still paying some of those debts. I'm not building a division that runs on the same bad math. He looked at the kitchen. Rosie had climbed back onto the counter. She wasn't supposed to. It was a whole thing they went around on regularly, and was trying to reach the cabinet where the good cereal was stored, which was on the high shelf specifically because unsupervised access to it was a problem. Rosie, he said, moving through the doorway. Off the counter. She got down without argument, which was unusual and probably indicated she'd already gotten into something. Into the phone, he said, "Give me a week to think about it." "Take 2, Natalie said. "The division isn't built yet. It'll be built when you come in and build it." A pause. "For what it's worth, and I know this probably doesn't move the needle for you, I've been thinking about what it costs a person to do what you did. 14 months, mostly alone, in a building where nobody knew your name. Finding something that wasn't your problem and making it your problem because you couldn't do anything else." Her voice was steady, but something in it had shifted. Not softer exactly, but more present. "That's not a job skill. That's a character trait, and it's a rarer one than people think." He opened the high cabinet, took down the cereal, put it on the counter in front of Rosie, who looked up at him with an expression that was trying to stay neutral and not succeeding. "You knew I was going to get down," she said. "I knew you were going to get down," he agreed. Into the phone. "I'll call you in a week." "Okay," Natalie said. And Dylan, the first time she'd used his name without it being part of a sentence about something operational, he noticed, "Go get some sleep." He ended the call and stood in his kitchen while his daughter poured cereal into a bowl she didn't need because she'd already eaten pancakes. And the morning light came through the window at an angle that caught the steam from her mug of hot chocolate and turned it gold for a moment before it dissipated. And he thought about 14 months of night shifts and hidden rooms and the low hum of a building breathing around him in the dark. He thought about the photograph of Rosie taped to the wall above the corkboard, slightly crooked, printed on plain paper, put there not as decoration, but as calibration, a reminder, every single night, of the specific coordinates of what mattered and why everything else had to stay in service of that. He thought about Victor Ashcroft in Federal Holding, the empire of 14 months beginning its long documented collapse. He thought about Warren Holt in handcuffs at 5:40 in the morning, in his own home, in the life he'd sold for deposits to an account in his wife's maiden name. He thought about Chin, who hadn't answered his attorney's calls, and who had stood at a funeral and said things about legacy and trust. He thought about the specific weight of a thing you find and can't put down, the way it changes your schedule and your sleep, and the mathematics of your daily life without ever quite changing the fundamental fact of who you are underneath it. He had been a maintenance technician for 14 months. He had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years before that. He had been a son and a student and a young man who thought he understood what the world required of him. He had been, for the past 6 years primarily, and above all else, a father. None of those things had replaced the others. They just accumulated, layered over each other in the way that experience layers, until the person standing in the kitchen on a Thursday morning making decisions about the next chapter of his life was all of those things simultaneously, imperfectly, with visible scars and a cut on his knuckles, and a 6-year-old who held injured hands in both of hers because she'd decided that helped. "Dad," Rosie said through a mouthful of cereal she didn't need, "are you thinking?" "Yeah." "About what?" He looked at her. The gap where the front tooth had been was beginning to fill in. He'd noticed it the past few days, the new tooth coming through, white and permanent and slightly too big for her face the way adult teeth always looked too big for small faces. She'd be 7 in February. She was going to be in 2nd grade in the fall. She had opinions about maple syrup and cereal shelving and stuffed rabbits with one eye, and she held his hand when it was hurt, and she asked him questions he couldn't always answer and accepted the incomplete answers without holding them against him. "About a new job," he said. She chewed, considered. "Is it a good job?" "I think so." "Does it have a good building?" He thought about the Vantara Tower, 48 floors of steel and glass and hidden tunnels, and a corkboard in a room that nobody knew about. He thought about a different building, a headquarters, 2 blocks from a school with a wait list, a division built from scratch by someone who got to define what it was. "Different building," he said. "I think it'll be a good one." "Okay," she said, and went back to her cereal, satisfied in the way that children are satisfied when the essential facts have been established and the details can sort themselves out. He made himself coffee and sat down at the table across from her, and the morning light moved across the kitchen floor in the slow way that morning light moves in late autumn, and for a while neither of them said anything at all, and it was exactly the right amount of nothing. 3 weeks later, Victor Ashcroft was indicted on 11 counts, including securities fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, and bribery of a public official through a related instrumentality that his attorneys spent 2 days trying to argue wasn't applicable and failed. The indictment ran to 43 pages and drew substantially from the documentation that Dylan's hidden room had preserved across 14 months of careful accumulation, and from the legally obtained records that Natalie's forensic team had recovered through channels that held up to every evidentiary challenge the defense attempted. Warren Holt accepted a plea arrangement in exchange for testimony. Gary Stiles did the same. Reynolds, who had been the most scared and the fastest to cooperate, received the most favorable terms and spent 6 months answering questions for federal investigators before his own legal situation was resolved. Chin, who had gone 8 days without responding to his attorney, before finally appearing with a different attorney who proved less optimistic, was the last to be processed and the least cooperative and received the least favorable outcome for all three of those reasons. The merger closed on the original timeline. 11 days after the night in the Vantara Tower, Natalie Prescott sat at a table with the Hartwell Group's leadership and signed documents that her father had spent 4 years trying to build toward, and that she had spent the past 3 weeks holding together through the kind of sustained operational pressure that people who study corporate crisis management write about in case studies after the fact. She signed without ceremony, without a speech, without the kind of moment-making that announcements of this size sometimes attracted. She signed because the work was done, and then she moved on to the next thing, which was the press statement, which was followed by the board restructuring, which was followed by the hiring process for 2 new board members to replace Reynolds and Chin, which was followed by a full audit of the company's security infrastructure that she oversaw personally with the focused attention of someone who had learned an expensive lesson about what happens when you trust without verifying. She was not a different person than she had been before the night in the tower. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind at least. The experience had not transformed her in some dramatic way, had not cracked her open and rebuilt her according to a better blueprint. She was still impatient and still occasionally too quick to conclude and still prone to the specific arrogance of smart people who've been right often enough to start treating their own judgment as something close to reliable. But she was different in one specific way, and she knew it, and it was this. She had fundamentally revised her understanding of who in a room was worth paying attention to. She had spent years, consciously or not, calibrating her attention to people with titles and positions and the kind of polish that expensive education and professional success produce. She had walked past a maintenance technician 100 times in a building she worked in and processed him as background, as furniture, as part of the infrastructure. She had done this without malice and without contempt, and with the complete unconscious ease of someone who had been taught, by the world's consistent feedback, that this was simply how rooms were organized. The man who'd been thinking further ahead than everyone with a title and a position and a badge. The man who'd spent 14 months in the hidden interior of the building she thought she controlled had never registered as someone she needed to see. And he'd used that invisibility deliberately, and it had worked. And that fact said something about her that she was going to spend a long time sitting with. Dylan Mercer took the job. He called on a Wednesday, 9 days after Natalie had made the offer, and said yes without extensive preamble. He'd made his decision. He was ready to talk about structure and timeline. Could they meet Thursday morning? She had cleared her entire Thursday morning before she'd finished saying yes. He came in at 9. He wore a decent shirt and slacks, and looked like someone who was aware of the difference between a job interview and a regular meeting and had landed approximately in the middle. He had a notepad with him, handwritten, and the notes on it were the most detailed preliminary organizational assessment she'd seen in her professional career, and she'd been through 4 strategic consulting engagements. He'd written it in 2 days, presumably in the evenings after Rosie was in bed, in the same careful and specific way he did everything else. They spent 3 hours going through it. She pushed back on 2 items and he didn't argue, but asked questions until he understood her reasoning and then either incorporated it or explained specifically why he thought the original approach was better. He was right both times. She told him so without making it a thing because he wasn't the kind of person who needed it to be a thing. When they finished, she poured them both coffee from the carafe on her credenza and said, "Start date?" 2 weeks, he said. "I have to give notice. Carl's going to need time to find coverage for the night shift." She thought about the fact that he was giving 2 weeks' notice to a facilities manager who ran his operation from a fantasy football app. For a maintenance job, he'd taken as cover for a 14-month counterintelligence operation, out of professional courtesy. She decided this was the most characteristic thing she could have learned about him. 2 weeks, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window of her office, the north-facing one, the big glass wall, the one she'd been sitting at 11 days before the worst night of her professional life, when the wind off the lake was just beginning to turn mean. The city was clear today, cold and bright the way Chicago gets in the weeks before winter fully arrives, the lake dark blue in the distance, and the skyline sharp against a sky that hadn't decided yet what it wanted to do. "You can see the Vantara Tower from here," he said. She looked. He was right. She'd never noticed. It was partially obscured by the building immediately to the north, but the top 8 or 9 floors were visible above the roofline, the upper windows catching the morning light. "I can see the 48th floor," she said. "Yeah." He looked at it for a moment, then looked away, back at the notepad, back to business. "The 2 items I'm pushing back on, I want to revisit the reporting structure for the technology access piece. I think you've got it routed through IT leadership, and that's exactly the kind of intermediary that creates the vulnerability you had before." "Show me," she said, and he did. Rosie started at the new school in January after the winter break, which gave her 4 months to settle in before the end of the year. She was predictably fine. She made 2 friends in the first week, a girl named Juniper who shared her strong opinions about the syrup-to-pancake ratio, and a boy named Theo who was missing the same front tooth she'd lost in October, which she found personally significant in a way Dylan didn't fully understand but respected. She had homework for the first time, which she approached with a combination of seriousness and complaint that seemed to him like a reasonable response to homework. He drove her in the mornings. It was 8 minutes from the apartment, and they spent it variously in conversation and in the specific companionable silence that develops between 2 people who have spent enough mornings together that they don't need to fill all of them. She asked him once, in February, what his job was now. She'd understood the maintenance job in the way children understand their parents' jobs, which is to say vaguely and in terms of the concrete details rather than the actual content. "I make sure the company is safe," he said, "from people who want to hurt it." "Like bad guys?" Sometimes. Sometimes it's more complicated than bad guys. But sometimes, yeah. She thought about this for the remaining 4 minutes of the drive. When he pulled up in front of the school, she said, "So like security? Something like that? Like when I'm the safety patrol at recess?" He looked at her. She was completely serious. "Yeah," he said. "Exactly like that." She nodded, satisfied, and got out of the car and walked into school with the confidence of a child who has decided her understanding of the situation is complete. He sat in the parking lane for a moment after she went in. He did that sometimes, took the extra 30 seconds before pulling out, just to let the fact of her land fully. The gap-toothed grin now filling in. The Juniper and Theo school with the syrup opinions. The homework and the safety patrol, and the stuffed rabbit with one eye sitting on the 3rd shelf of her bookcase, where it had lived since she turned 6 and decided she was too old to sleep with it, but not ready to put it somewhere else. The ordinary texture of a life that had been, for 14 months, built around absences she didn't know to name. He pulled out and drove to work. The new office was on the 31st floor of the Prescott Global building, a space that had been a conference room until 3 weeks ago, and that he'd spent 2 days personally reconfiguring because he had specific ideas about sightlines and exit access and the placement of the one window relative to the primary work surface. Ideas that the facilities team had accommodated with the slightly puzzled patience of people who didn't fully understand the reasoning, but could see that the person requesting the changes knew exactly what he wanted. It was a good office. Not large, he didn't need large, but organized the way he liked things organized, which was to say that everything was where it was for a reason, and the reason was documented somewhere in his head, even if it wasn't on paper. He had 2 people on the team so far. A former federal fraud investigator named Delaney Marsh, 34, who had the specific institutional paranoia that fraud work produces and who asked better questions than most people twice her experience. And a systems analyst named Owen Park, 26, who had come from a cybersecurity consulting background and who could read a data architecture the way Dylan read a building, as a system with vulnerabilities to be found before someone else found them first. Small team, right team. The kind of structure that could hold its shape under pressure because it was built tight rather than big. He had standing access to Natalie Prescott. Not scheduled meetings, standing access, which meant he could come to her with an issue and she would carve out the time, and she had not once in 8 weeks failed to do exactly that. He'd used it 7 times. 4 of them were things she'd expected him to flag. 3 of them she hadn't, and in 2 of those cases his assessment had changed a decision she was in the middle of making, and she'd told him so plainly both times without making it a bigger moment than it was. It was a functional relationship, which was what he needed it to be, and what she seemed to need it to be as well. 2 people who understood what the other one was good at, and built their collaboration around that understanding rather than around the weight of what they'd been through together. The night in the tower was present, the way any significant shared experience is present, but neither of them pointed at it or used it as the foundation of anything. What they built was built on what came after. There was one evening in April when he was in the office late. Rosie, at a school event that Mrs. Kowalski had taken her to, a spring performance of some kind, the details of which Rosie had explained to him in detail, and he had mostly followed. And Natalie came down the hallway and stopped in the doorway and said, "Why are you still here?" "Reading," he said. He had a file open on his desk, a vendor contract, third-party logistics partner, flagged by Delaney for a clause that deserved more attention than it had received during the original negotiation. She leaned in the doorway. She was still in her work clothes, which meant she'd had a late meeting or had been at the office as long as he had, or both. "Anything serious?" "Probably not. A contract clause that gives the vendor more access to our shipment routing data than they need for their stated function." He paused. "Probably just sloppy lawyering, but it's the kind of thing that becomes useful to the wrong person if the wrong person ever gets interested in a vendor relationship." She was quiet for a moment. He recognized the quality of the quiet. It was the kind that comes from someone who has recently had a concrete and specific experience of exactly what happens when the wrong person gets interested in something that seemed routine. "Fix it," she said, already drafting the amendment request. She nodded, stayed in the doorway another moment. Outside the window, the city was doing what Chicago does in April, trying to be spring and not quite managing it. The lake still gray, the light better, but the temperature not yet trusting. "How's Rosie?" she asked. "Spring performance tonight," he said. "Mrs. Kowalski took her. She's been practicing whatever her part is for 3 weeks and refuses to tell me what it is because she wants it to be a surprise." Natalie smiled. A real one, not the controlled professional version she deployed in meetings. "Does she know you hate surprises?" He considered this. "I don't hate surprises. I just prefer to have complete information." "That's the same thing." "It's meaningfully different." She pushed off the doorframe. "Good night, Dylan." "Good night." He heard her footsteps go down the hall, heard the elevator open and close, and then the floor was quiet, in the way that buildings get quiet when they're mostly empty. A working quiet, systems running, the structure doing its job without anyone watching. He turned back to the contract amendment. He worked for another 40 minutes, finished what needed to be finished, organized what needed to be organized, and turned off the office light. In the elevator down, he checked his phone. A photo from Mrs. Kowalski, taken from the audience, slightly blurry, the way her photos always were because she held the phone slightly wrong. But clear enough, Rosie on a stage with other children, wearing what appeared to be a paper flower costume of some kind, grinning with a mouth that was beginning, finally, to look like her permanent mouth, the adult teeth settling in, the small face growing incrementally into them. She had not told him what the costume was. That was the surprise, apparently. He looked at the photo for most of the elevator ride down. Then he texted back to Mrs. Kowalski. "She's good?" The reply came before he reached the lobby. "She is wonderful. She said to tell you she didn't mess up." He wrote back, "She never messes up," which was not entirely accurate as a factual matter. Rosie messed up with some regularity, as 6-year-olds do, as everyone does, but which was accurate in the way that certain things are accurate that can't be measured or documented or put in a file. He put his phone away and walked through the lobby and out into the April evening, where the wind off the lake was still cold but had lost its mean edge, and the city was lit up around him in the way cities are lit up when they don't know you're looking, just going about their business in all directions at once. He walked to his car. He drove to the school to pick up his daughter. The performance was long over by the time he arrived, and Rosie was in the lobby with Mrs. Kowalski and Juniper's mother and 3 other children from her class, all of them still wearing fragments of their costumes because they'd refused to fully change out of them. Rosie's paper flower petals were wilting slightly from the heat of the auditorium. She had a smear of something gold on her cheek that was probably face paint. She saw him come through the door and ran. He caught her. She weighed exactly what she weighed, 47 pounds. He knew this from her last checkup. She had been deeply interested in the number and had made him calculate how many of her it would take to equal his weight, which came out to approximately 3.8 Rosies, which she had found very funny. And she smelled like face paint and lavender soap and the warm child smell that he had never found a word for. But that was, of all the sensory data his nervous system processed on any given day, the one that landed most completely. "I didn't mess up," she said, against his shoulder. "Mrs. Kowalski told me," he said. "You were great." "I was a chrysanthemum." "I could tell," he said, which was a complete lie delivered without hesitation, and she pulled back and looked at him with the specific skepticism of a child who knows when she is being handled. "You couldn't tell," she said. "I couldn't tell," he agreed. She seemed to find this acceptable. She settled back against him, the wilting paper petals of the chrysanthemum costume pressing into his jacket, and he stood in the lobby of her school with his daughter in his arms, and the ordinary noise of parents and children all around them, and the April night visible through the glass doors. And he was aware, in the clear and unembellished way he was aware of most things, that this was the point. That all of it, the 14 months and the hidden rooms and the maintenance tunnels, and the 22 seconds in a corridor and the sealed boardroom and the federal response, and the evidence and the new office, and the contract amendments and the team he was building, all of it was in service of this exact weight in his arms and this exact moment in a school lobby with the worst of the winter finally over. He had never been a man who needed to be seen. He had spent most of his adult life being useful in the dark, in spaces nobody else entered, toward goals that were complete in themselves regardless of whether anyone knew about them. That was not a character flaw, and it was not a wound, even if it had sometimes looked like both. It was just who he was, the shape of the thing he'd become, and he had stopped trying to decide whether it was good or bad, and had started just trying to make it count. It had counted. It was counting now, and would keep counting, in the work, and in the mornings, and in the drives to school, and in the 47-pound weight of a chrysanthemum who hadn't messed up. He carried her to the car. She talked the entire way. He listened to every word.